Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Before I introduce our guest for this month's episode, along with the topics being discussed, the Human Rights Education Now podcast, beginning with this episode, is transitioning to one long-form episode per month from our former 2-episode per month format. This change should enhance continuity of the dialogue for listeners, and we welcome your feedback about the change going forward. Today's program is a conversation with Jack L. Nelson, Professor Emeritus at the Rutgers Graduate School of Education and one of the United States' leading scholars on academic freedom and civic education. I have known Jack for over 40 years, and in the interests of full disclosure, he was my dissertation advisor for my doctorate at Rutgers University. The following topics are discussed in this episode: the origins of Jack's interest in pursuing a career in education and his path from secondary school social studies teacher to professor in higher education, how he embraced a critical stance towards the field of social studies and its impact on his work as a scholar and teacher, his scholarship about social studies education and its connection to human rights, his work on academic freedom issues and the challenges he has encountered in advocating for academic freedom for many years, the impact of contemporary assaults on academic freedom, notably on educators, steps which public education can take to guarantee academic freedom in the U.S. and globally, the role of the American Association of University Professors in defending academic freedom, and the individual who has had the greatest influence on Jack's work defending academic freedom, along with a quote which sums up his view of the importance of academic freedom and the right to education, and finally his recommendation for advancing academic freedom in the U.S., despite the many obstacles we face today. Well, I am just so thrilled that I am having a conversation today with Dr. Jack Nelson, who, based on full disclosure, was my dissertation advisor at the Rutgers Graduate School of Education, but also is one of the nation's leading experts on academic freedom. How are you doing today, Jack?
Well, I'm doing well, thank you, Bill. I'm certainly glad you graduated. It made me happier.
Well, it was just not me. There were plenty of people who benefited from your expertise at Rutgers.
Oh, thank you.
So I'd like to know how you first became interested in pursuing a career in education and how you moved from being a secondary school social studies teacher to being a professor.
Well, when I was young, I was a depression baby, and my family didn't have much money. And for a long period of time, I still suffered from that mentality. The result was they had a friend who had been a chemical engineer, and I thought through high school that's what I'd like to be. I enjoyed chemistry and physics, and then I got to college and found out it was a 5-year program, and I could not afford 5 years of tuition. I had a scholarship and was working part-time and taking a loan from the university every quarter. So then I thought, okay, well, my very best teacher in high school was a history teacher, a guy named Tillon Erb. And he taught history as an inquiry program where you're given challenges and questions and issues. So I thought I'll look into that. So I started the history degree, and I ran into a professor of history at the university who was a name, date, event memorization person, and he taught the class that way. And his tests were all that way, and it was mostly memorization of information. And after 1 quarter, I got out of there and transferred to night school just to avoid him for the second 2 quarters, and changed my major to social science area. Okay, so that gives you some notion of my skepticism of history. So I got involved then. I was in the Army. I was in ROTC because of the Korean War at the time. You would have been drafted if you hadn't been in ROTC. So I got into the Army, required 2 years of active duty. So I went to the Army and I had my teaching certificate for the Denver schools. And I thought I'd go back there to teach. But instead, the job offer never did happen. I was in Texas and I sent to the university and said, send my papers out. Where are the teacher jobs? And they said, they're all in California. So I decided, all right, I'll send them out there. And I got 2 job offers in about a week. And I had a colleague who was the only one on our whole unit from California. I said, if you had your choice between Bakersfield and Riverside, what would you choose? And he just laughed at me. So I picked Riverside and it was good. I started teaching there in social studies and enjoyed it. But in the very beginning, a group of the teachers in that department were doing their master's degrees at Los Angeles State College, and they offered me a ride and we'd all share driving in and out. So I started doing that, and I got completed with a master's degree. And in the last class, the chairman of the department said, "We've just started an instructorship program, and we'd like to offer you an instructorship in our department." And I took it. So I left the public schools and started teaching. He said, the only condition is you have to start a doctoral program. Well, I, of course, had not thought about doing that, but I did it. So I got finished with the doctorate program. In the meantime, was then teaching college courses at LA State College, which I just sort of stayed in that career. So it's not something I thought about as an elementary school child.
So when you were doing this was in the 50s and early 60s, correct?
Well, this would have been, yes, I got out of the Army in 1956 and did my master's then, finished in 57, I guess. I don't remember the date right now. And started teaching at LA State immediately and started working on my doctorate at Southern Cal.
Okay, so one of the interesting things about that period, of course, is the challenge to academic freedom that happened under McCarthyism. And so you had mentioned to me at some point in the past that you had seen that firsthand in terms of how that had been imposed on people when you were in high school. Can you talk about that?
Well, yeah, there were several. I ran into several different things when I was teaching at LA State. As you know, faculty don't get paid a lot of money, so I was doing substitute. I would teach in the late afternoons, and I do substitute teaching in school districts. And I kept running across kids that were having problems. And a lot of the Mexican American kids there in those school districts, Southern California. And the police would just stop them, take everything out of their car, including the seats, put them on the roadway, and then find nothing wrong and just leave them. And it just was happening more often than so. I got involved then with sort of those kinds of issues about people. And then in one of my classes at LA State, there was a professor, a guy named Bill Gellerman, whom I didn't know anything about at the time. He was teaching philosophy of ed. And we'd go into his class, and these were in old Army buildings. The LA State was a brand new school about that time. And they're housing all the classes in old military buildings while they're waiting for a new campus. And he would come into the class, we'd all be in there. And in those days, they read all the class students because the GI Bill required you to keep attendance records. So he'd get in the room and he'd lock the door. And I thought that was very surprising. Every time he had a class, he'd lock the door and then he'd read the class member to make sure everyone there had actually fully registered. So it got me interested, and I began to look into it. I met him a little bit, but he was a very aloof professor, very good, but aloof. I then found out that he had written for his dissertation at Teachers College in Columbia, had written a dissertation on Martin Dye's committee, which Martin Dye was a congressman and later became the HUAC. in the anti-communist period. And then Gellerman did his degree, and then he was teaching at Northwestern University. And he was listed while he was at Northwestern. As I began doing some research work in this, he was listed in a book about, they didn't call them communist professors, but they called them pinko or communist sympathizers. They were avoiding lawsuits. And he was listed in that book. I was just going through it, and he was listed in there, had a photograph of him at Northwestern. As a result of all that, he got fired at Northwestern and took this job at LA State then, some couple of years before I got there. And they were helping him hide, and he was locking the door. He was fearful all that whole time. He'd written a book called The American Legion as Educator, which was a pretty detailed, very interesting book I did some years ago. He looked at the American Legion's effort to write an American history book for the schools, and then their effort to try and force school districts to use it. And it was a real expose, but as a result of which he lost his job at a very good university, ends up hiding in a very small new state college in California. That was one. Then I had a series of other examples. I met a guy named Kaishin when I was in Buffalo, who was an English instructor actually at the time, and he did not want to sign the loyalty oath. There was a state law in New York, the Feynman law, that required them to sign loyalty oaths, and he refused to sign it. And as a result of his refusal, they threatened his job. And he and about 5 others who were also instructors at the University of Buffalo filed suit. And that suit got to the Supreme Court. It's under the name of Kaishian. And he was only an instructor. I mean, he could have lost his job anyway without without much fanfare. But the result of all that was they won the case. The law was found unconstitutional, and they threw out the loyalty oath. But just those kind of examples just seemed to occur as I was sort of going through periods of my career, and it just bothered me that was a circumstance.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, it was New Jersey's William Brennan who wrote that decision, Keishi and Visa's Board of Regents.
Yeah, Brennan was a dandy. I wish he was still around.
Me too. So, as part of this whole orientation that you developed in terms of your career, you also, over the period of time, became known, and I think in a very good way, as having embraced a critical stance towards the field. And can you talk a little bit about how that approach influenced your work in teaching and scholarship?
Yes. As I suggested a moment ago, I was not born and bred to be an historian and a lover of looking at archives and trying to fit them together. You do a fine job at that, but I wasn't sort of devoted to that. And I had a kind of a skeptical understanding of the nature of history. And then I began to discover that the history itself wasn't the big culprit. It was the idea that, as you know, the victors write the history, and then whether or not that's just being taught to kids as the only history and the true history was always troubling to me, so I got involved with different fields, mostly looking at political sociology and politics, which I got very intrigued with, and trying to get some sense of it. And I adopted what you call the critical stance. I would say skeptical, but certainly critical, in the sense that I see criticism as being both negative and positive. So where I see positive things in the effort to have continuing history, there's an improved effort, I think, in revisionist history. So I've always been interested in the new historians, as published in the Radical History magazine and others, in the new historians sort of rethinking what history was like. And that became even clearer during the 50s and 60s, and then much later when his black history suddenly emerged as though it had never been dealt with before. And when you look at the American history books, you find out that was the case. They just acted as though there was no such thing. And so then we had, that emergence of black history and the better treatment of slavery and so on. And it's under attack right now, but that was an evolving thing in the 60s. Uh, and then, Howard Zinn's book came out, and he became sort of noted for that. And I guess they're still having programs with the Zen education program to try and teach a different way of coming at history. It's that different way that I liked and I appreciated. But because social studies, when I got involved in it, which was when I was at Buffalo, I was involved with trying to establish a college level group of instructors. And we got it going, and that became what later was CUFA and NCSS. And that group also seemed more skeptical. When we got to national, what we found was they were dominated by old-fashioned, I thought, narrowly oriented historians, and their students. They were really the dominant figures in NCSS. The speakers of the national conference were almost entirely drawn from that in the earliest days. And we tried under CUFA to sort of change our orientation. So we had many, many papers presented that were highly critical of the standard historical approach and so on. And I'd like to believe there was some influence on NCSS, but my sense is, and the paper you and I did some years ago, I think, indicates the same thing, that they were very late in dealing with controversial issues. And that should be one of the forefront things in social studies, is to try to get students to deal with controversy. But instead, the major controversies NCSS just ignored. They're not written about in their journal. They don't. I didn't find them presented at the conferences and so on. That did change some over time, but I guess that fits within that framework of being critical. It just seemed to me that the field I was heavily invested in for a long time did not have itself a critical stance.
Well, just for our listeners, the CUFA acronym refers to the College and University Faculty Assembly, which is a
Oh,
part of the National Social Studies Council. But getting back to that, Jack, that's an interesting issue because, as you know, there really was a critical strand in social studies that was strongly in favor of academic freedom going back to the 1930s, going through
yes,
people like Larry Metcalf and Shaver
that's
and
true.
people of that sort. And I think it's interesting why that never became sort of the dominant part of the field. What do you think?
Well, I don't know why, except that I knew I can't think of his name right now. The executive director was for years and years and years at NCSS was among the most conservative people in the whole field, and he did not want anything to change things. And when I proposed setting up CUFA, he would not have it. And I went around his back, and we got it established anyway, mostly with the help of Larry Metcalf. Uh, Jim Shaver was not involved, but he was at a later point in time. But I picked people I'd never heard of before. I'd heard of them, but never had known them. And got them as an executive committee for CUFA before CUFA was built. We didn't have a name for it then. And we thought we'd have one meeting, but we needed the approval of NCSS to have that meeting. So we kind of snuck that in. And then it turned out to be a thoughtful, professional, highly rated group of people who were on the committee. And that got the attention of NCSS. So then we could form our own group, but they wanted to control the meetings. So then we set up separate meetings on a different day. That was the origin of CUFA. But you're right. Larry Metcalf was, one of my favorite people, and Jim Shaver too, because of the project when he was a student at Harvard. The project that they got involved in, which was a real attempt to redo and rethink all of social studies. and they found themselves in trouble, and the schools were forced to give up all those great materials that they had developed in that Harvard project.
And the same thing applied to Harold Rugg, of course, and
Oh,
the
yeah.
censorship of Harold Rugg. Ron Evans has done a great book on that to show how his work was systematically censored in the public schools.
Yes. Oh, well, it wasn't at first. At first, he was the most popular writer of history books in the public schools at one time, Rugg, until he got attacked, and suddenly he's out. And there was a great little book that Upton Sinclair did. He had two books. One was called The Goose Step, in which he was describing a university, he'd gone to Columbia, big universities, and the presidents of them, and how they tried to limit academic and did limit academic freedom for a lot of faculty members and so on. And then he wrote a second book called The Goslings, and that was all about public education. I used to use it in classes once in a while, but it became very difficult to find. I just couldn't find copies of it. Uh, but when he dealt with the public schools, and he wrote a lot of the kind of things I wrote about much later on in my career. But he was just kind of a renegade. He'd run for governor of California, and he was I had a close friend when I was teaching at LA State who was a big believer in Upton Sinclair, and he started a little journal called Uppy Speaks that I used to write little pieces for once in a while. So, but there were some efforts on occasion, but they were almost entirely struck down in the various times by things like the Comstock people and the efforts of the anti-communists and the Red Scare, and then the anti-communism in the 40s and 50s and the Birch Society. And they began to dominate school districts and so on. But it goes back even further. I mean, that's what Gillerman was really writing about in his early works. And one
So,
of my
yeah.
favorite high school teacher, maybe I should give you this a bit too. My favorite high school teacher, Tillman Erb, was he taught history there. He had a master's degree in history, and he'd been teaching in the Denver schools for some long period of time, had tenure, and very well thought of. But he got investigated by the state HUAC kind of group because of his advocacy. He never was I mean, they were just trying to get him to. He was not a communist. He never had a card, but they were trying to get him to talk about other colleagues of his, and he refused to do it. And they hounded him, and it then became public in the newspaper. And I was at the local university, and I was reading the Denver newspaper, and here's a story about this teacher who lost his job from the Denver schools, and it was Tillman Erb. So I went over to see what that was all about, and I couldn't find him because he was gone. But then shortly afterward, he had appealed because he had tenure, and they gave him a hearing, and after the hearing, they were forced after that hearing to give him a job back. So I went over to visit him in high school. In the high school, I was just finishing my undergraduate, and he was really a broken man by that time. And I said, "Well, tell me what's happening." He said, "Well, they were forced to give me my job back, but they won't allow me to teach history. I have to teach English, and I hate it. I don't really want to do that." Okay, that was their way of dealing with him. He left and moved to California, and he was investigated out here. I was looking up stuff many years ago, and I ran into a record of the HUAC people in California and the Nashville then, still trying to get him to give up anybody he knew, and he's in this report in the archives. He's saying, "Please don't hassle my wife. She has heart troubles." I mean, it's a very heart wrenching kind of statement. This poor old teacher from high school was caught in that vice. So I can understand how people would would just say, like Bill Gunnerman, I'm getting out of here. I can't take this.
So in the late 70s, early 80s, you and Vera Green at Rutgers edited a book about international human rights, and it was called International Human Rights Contemporary
Oh,
Issues.
yes,
How did
indeed.
what was the genesis of that, and how did you conceptualize the connections between social studies, education, and human rights?
Oh, okay. I'd been interested in, well, I moved from LA State. I got there it was a great place, University of Buffalo. Rockefeller had just put a lot of money into establishing 4 research centers, and that was one of them. And I was amazed I got the job offer. So we moved to Buffalo, and it was a wide open, kind of beautiful, great campus to be in, a lot of interdisciplinary studies. And there was a professor of politics and one of philosophy and economics, and I think psychology, and I set up an international center for international studies there because we all had I'd only done research in it, and while I was developing an area I called nationalistic education. And so we started this center, and as a result of that, I was invited by Betty Reardon at Columbia to attend a summer program on world order studies at Exeter, at the school in Exeter, and I did that, and that's where I met Saul Menlowitz and Richard Falk. Now, Falk and Menlowitz had written a 4-volume book on how to restructure the UN to significantly improve it. And they had a big, there were some Wall Street bankers that were supporting this big effort, and they put a lot of money into it because their argument was there needed to be a strong international order, and Menlowitz and Falk both had this idea of how to organize that. And Falk his whole career was at Princeton. He was I think the Milbank professor there of international law at the Wilson School, and Saul Menlowitz was at Rutgers in the law school, and he had an endowed chair there, and he was there his whole career too, as far as I know. Well, anyway, so I got a chance to meet them. We had this seminar, and I got interested in it. And the same sort of meeting was when I met David Bridges, and Bridges was a professor at Cambridge, and David and I were just talking about things that might come out of this. And one was that there'd be some kind of program for teachers that would, American teachers could go to England and study the English system, and then he would bring some from England to America, and our 2 institutions would provide support for those things. And so we both started working on that, communicating in those days, of course, by letter. And I was able to start that program. It's the one you attended sometime after that. You and Sheila came on one of them. I was able to organize American teachers, and he then organized the speakers and that sort of thing. And then we just made the arrangements there in Cambridge. And then he was going to do it the second year, and he contacted me after the first year over there and said, the English teachers, I've tried to get them. They're very interested. They can't afford it. Their salaries are so low. They just can't afford to make the trip even. So from that point on, I just did a program in there, 15 years, I think, over in England. So I had this sort of long-term interest deriving out of this interest in international studies and my concern that nationalism was overcoming most countries, and they're using the schools to do it. I mean, that's sort of a long way of getting around to that. But I got then a grant from the World Order Studies people to set up a center for World Order Studies at Rutgers when I moved there. Actually, I got the grant at Buffalo, but I was just changing to Rutgers at the time. And so I housed this grant in the International Center, and Dick Wilson was the political scientist at Rutgers who was in charge of the International Center. and he recommended that we could use some of this money for a grant to have a program that would would fit all of our interests. And I had an interest then in human rights that was just sort of emerging out of that United Nations restructuring kind of world order stuff. And so Dick recommended that I talk with Vera Green, who was an anthropologist at Rutgers. And Vera was a Latin American scholar. And so I thought, well, that'll add a real good dimension to it. So Vera and I organized this conference that my grant paid for. And we invited, at that time, there was an emerging group of people interested in global studies across different fields. And so they all presented papers, and this, I think it's the Coleman group contacted me about putting the papers together in book form. So I talked to them, and they agreed if we would do the editing, and they approved it in the long run, we could put it together as a book. So Vera and I agreed to do that. We had this, must have been about a week-long program with all these presentations. The one I still remember was one by Christian Bay, who was a political economist at the University of Toronto, and he did a really fine presentation on what he called the paradox, which I'd seen as a major issue in all of social education. The paradox between trying to produce people that are national patriots and trying to produce people that will improve that society. And it is a paradox. It's one of the things I see in education all the time. But he wrote a really nice piece about that, dealing with it in terms of politics. Anyway, so we had the whole set of papers that Vera and I then edited and wrote the interstitial material for, and Coleman published it. So that was sort of the essence of the book.
So that book sort of provided you with a way to think about social studies through a human rights lens. But at that time, there was really no, quote, field of human rights education.
No, it emerged, yeah.
I'm interested to know what you saw as the connections between what you did in that book and what those were, and social studies, which you did every day.
Well, it seems to me, it may seem a bit silly, but it seems to me an obvious connection. I mean, what social education should be about is exactly that. There's seeing the whole notion of human rights and relationships among people, and that's quite different, it seems to me, from the kind of nationalistic treatment that is quite often put on the schools, where they mostly spend time on patriotism, on the Star-Spangled Banner and the pledging allegiance and so on. So yes, it seems to me that they're heavily intertwined, as opposed to being two things that I connect. I just see them as intertwined. Human rights just emerges out of what I think social education ought to be dealing with. It's a social justice, equality. There are all kinds of things involved in it.
So if we think about the founding rationale for public education, one of it is to develop citizens. But in order to do that, you have to have the freedom to teach and learn, and that's often been called, quote, academic freedom. So what are the things that you found to be the greatest challenges in advocating academic freedom over your career?
Well, I've sort of dealt with some of them already. One is the highly traditional orientation of the schools, and more particularly social studies. I find much more liberal orientation toward what's being taught in the English departments than I do in the social studies departments. That's always surprised me. The National Council for Teachers of English, as an example, has a center on intellectual freedom, and they have publications on it. They have a director, just a woman named I used to know her. I can't think of her name right now, but she was involved. She was with the NCTE. I tried to get NCSS to do that, and they saw that as too volatile, too difficult, and so on. And when you look on the NCSS website now, it's hard to find anything about academic freedom. You have to hunt into the documents to find it. I chaired the Academic Freedom Committee at one point in time, and you've been active in it. And I've had several other people who've been very active in it. It was impossible to convince NCSS that it was an important enough topic. But so it just seems to me that social ed, if any group should be concerned about academic freedom, it should be trying to educate people for society, which includes citizenship. But it isn't. It seems to me it's not citizenship in the sense of being a dedicated patriot. It's a patriot because you understand dissent is important, and the operation of democracy requires rethinking ideas all the time, including what's in our history. So it seems to me that what you call academic freedom, I would too. When you said student and teacher, I sort of frame it in a larger context of intellectual freedom. That students need the intellectual freedom to look into all kinds of things, and and the teacher should help them examine that, and assist them in that. And the teachers need the specific academic freedom to do something entirely different from what the students are expecting, and perhaps even different from what the teacher believes, where they teach an antithetical viewpoint, a radical view to their own. I did some studies on nationalistic education some long time ago, looked into state laws and how they control this sort of whole effort. Speaking about academic freedom, there was one in California, as the law still exists, and it says, this isn't done in the anti-communist time. Communism is an important issue, and the students in schools need to, this is in the education code, students in the schools need to know about it, and it needs to be taught in the schools so the students get a clear understanding of communism, it's the ideas, the orientation, and all that. And the second paragraph says, in no case shall communism be taught in such a way that the student comes away desiring to be a communist, or so. Well, it's that ambivalence that, or a paradox, if you wish, in the Christian Bay terms, that just shows up. Florida had a very similar kind of law. Now Florida's gotten even worse. They're just banning under the argument that they're giving students academic freedom. What they're doing is limiting the freedom by requiring them to go through very limited, very narrow perspectives. So can't say gay as an example.
Yeah, so let's take that idea of what is happening now. And it's not only at the state level, not only at the local level. The federal government has put the full force of their influence behind this. So moving ahead down the road, what do you see as some of the consequences of these very serious attacks if there's no effective pushback?
I see them as cyclic. I think the current ones are terrible, mostly because you now have the federal government involved through its agencies, not through committees like HUAC, where certain legislators get certain sway, but the long-term result could be that an extinguishment of what we call the American experiment. It would, it would simply be gone. But I'm an optimist essentially, and in that framework, I see. Let's go back and look in time. You go back to the 1920s and earlier than that, before there was public education, the 1800s. The schools were just very traditional. They were just training programs essentially. They were memorizing the what's the name? I have to think of the name of the moral tales that nearly all elementary schools had. They weren't public, but not all the kids were involved. But they learned how to be a highly moral person under the religious orientations of whatever colony and whatever group, whatever state they were in. with the advent of public education under industrialization and mass education, there was some move to become, there were training programs still largely, but there was then a move to evolve into more citizenship, more civic responsibility kind of things, and that was a healthy thing. But there've been efforts to stop that all along, and sometimes they've been fairly successful. I was a teacher in the period when the Birch Society was putting in all their libraries, putting special Birch Society books on display, and they were banning, and the school districts were banning all kinds of other books, or putting them on, so students had to go to the librarian and have special permission to read one of those books. And we got through all that, not entirely well, but we got some strengthening. If you go back and look at what happened to academic freedom in higher education, you find that college faculty were just fired pretty much whenever the very institution colleges then, what they would decide to do, they just fire people. Sometimes they would fire them on an annual basis and just hire some back again. There was no tenure. So if you say that, what's likely to happen, I say, well, one possibility is a loss of what we call America, and I'm hoping somewhere else in the world it arises, something that is even better than that, because I still believe in the cycles. But I think in the cycles in America alone, where we've got a pretty long-lasting democracy, even though it's not a full and complete democracy. So the likelihood is that, from my view, that we're going to have a shift back away from the current extreme right-wing, limited, narrow dimensions to a more closer to the old progressive education system. Progressive ed came in. I happened to go to a high school that was in one of the few cities that was progressive education city. So I may have had the opportunity for an education different from a lot of other people. But from my view, it's a better education that way.
So let's broaden the focus a little bit. The right to education is viewed as fundamental in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Yes.
And recently, the Special Rapporteur on Education from the UN, Farida Shahid, has argued that academic freedom should be seen as an autonomous human right, central to Article 28 of the Universal Declaration. So if we think about that, how can public education, and I mean it from K to university, take some steps to guarantee academic freedom? And you can talk about it in the US, but also internationally.
Well, I think it'd be nearly impossible internationally to have an effect. The United States, as you know, has not ratified most of the UN documents. So it's pretty hard for us to sit back and say, we should improve them. We usually agree to what they say, but we don't stamp them with a legal approval. It just seems to me that the UN is a decent opportunity to express academic freedom. I think that's a suitable thing to do, is to have that written into the documents. How do we protect it? We've not been very good at protecting it in the U.S. But what emerged, the AAUP as the example, in 1915, college faculty members were fired pretty much at will, but some very important ones at Stanford. Stanford was started by a man, Leland Stanford, who made a lot of money in railroads construction out in California. And they started the Leland Stanford for his son, Leland Stanford Junior College. And he died, and his wife became a leading figure financially behind that, what became the university. And there was a professor out there who made a lot of presentations about how the railroad industry had been a serious problem for society, and how the financiers were taking, stealing money in effect and all that. So she said he needs to be fired. So they started to threaten him, and they did. And six other, there were only like 15 faculty members in the whole university at the time. Six other faculty members joined him, and he left. He went to Johns Hopkins, I believe. At the same time, there were firings at Harvard, and they got some very prominent people fired there. And as a result, there were a couple of people, an economist and the philosophy professor from Stanford, who formed what later became known as the AUP. And they wrote this document protecting academic freedom, which they titled Academic Freedom and Tenure. And they got good old John Dewey to be the president of that in 1915. And so this document became the leading document of the time, but it linked it, as AUP has continuously, to tenure. Well, in colleges, as you know, tenure in most under the AUP guidelines is after 6 years. When you're given your 7th year contract, you have automatic tenure. I was a counsel defender of about something in the range of 20 or 30 faculty, another 30 or 40 at Rutgers, who were denied tenure. And we would fight the administration and try and document it. We would always win if they'd gone to that 7th year. So the university got wise, but it was only an ethical thing. I mean, the AUP has no legal requirement. But what they were smart in doing is when they first formed, they got all kinds of professional organizations, and they finally got the Organization of University Administrators, and they adopted that document, modified it a couple of times. The last one I think is 1940, but the idea was protecting academic freedom through tenure. That's tenuous, but better than none. Because the tenure does not protect young faculty members, some of whom may deserve it. Well, you should say all of whom deserve it, but some of whom may need it badly. But they don't have tenure, so they've got no real protection. Once they have tenure, at least there is some protection there. And after that came in, then some states began putting tenure laws in for public school teachers. And so a good many states, some 20 or 30, I think, have tenure laws that require teachers that have been there sometimes only 2 and 3 years, but they've been there a period of time and have demonstrated their competence as teachers. So tenure is certainly one, but there needs to be, and then you have a few Supreme Court cases that you could link up with it. That Kaishan being one example. That if they're really outrageous examples of firing for something like that, but not many faculty members can themselves or can find the support to take something to the Supreme Court to test that. So I think there needs to be something built in more than just the ethical statement that that's a nice thing to do to protect academic freedom. And there used to be the sort of, it may have been just a myth, that that's what higher education is all about. And a lot of us labored under that. That's being torn apart now by the Trump administration and is being complied with by some very good universities like Harvard and Columbia and so on. So I don't mean to divert off of that, but I'd like to have a good answer for how to protect it, but it probably should be protected in some kind of constitutional or some kind of UN international document that is agreed to.
Well, it's interesting too, because when I was an undergraduate in 1970 to 74 at Rutgers, 70% of the faculty in the United States in higher ed were on tenure track positions.
Yes.
Today, it's 30%.
Yep.
So the vast number of instructors or teachers in higher education are never going to get tenure.
That's right.
That means that the whole area of instruction, I mean, vast amounts of people, right, are not really protected.
Exactly right. In fact, I should have written about it. I gave a couple of presentations on exactly that topic. That what was happening. This was happening way before the 70s. There was a surplus. The worst surplus, by the way, was PhDs in history, American history. I I worked at various places with guys with doctorates in American history, and they were there. They were running student programs, or they were in dormitory work, or that kind of things. They were around the university, but they weren't faculty members. And anyway, so my argument at that time was that it was too easy to hire these people on a part-time basis, and the management of universities. It strikes me again, Upton Sinclair was right that the main administrators of the universities are beholden primarily to the business communities, not so much the academic ones. There are relatively few intellectual leaders. You probably can't identify any uh, in American higher education now as presidents of various places. They may be good people and they're doing good work, but they're managers, and a lot of them they have academic degrees, but they really come out of and the boards of governors are almost entirely business people. I remember when we voted no confidence in the Rutgers president, we suddenly got a lot of interest from board members at Rutgers, and a couple of them invited me to meetings. One of whom invited a group of us up to New York City, and he was the quotes labor appointee, and he was like the steward of longshoreman union there, and he took us to lunch at a very fancy New York restaurant to convince us to lay off of the poor president. He was just a nice guy, and we shouldn't be attacking him. We didn't take it to heart, but that was their way of handling things. Well, they put the presidents of these institutions in a box like that, and they're not the ones that are likely to protect academic freedom. They'll run if they have to, or they'll give up all the money that they've been getting for various things, as institutions are doing now, so that the federal administration can say, "Look, this is what we're doing," and now the feds want to get access to how faculty are determined, and on how students are, who decides which students come in, and you develop a kind of a litmus test, a political litmus test for academics, which is a complete denial of academic freedom.
Well, it seems to me, and I think you would agree with this, that there really needs to be a much more of a popular front approach, a collaboration between higher education, professional associations, and K-12 educators, because it's easy to fragment it otherwise.
Yeah, exactly right. Well, you and I are writing a paper, as you know, on which that's one of our arguments, that teachers need to get together with, or organizationally. That's where outfits like the Council of Teachers of English and the Council of Teachers of Social Studies should be getting together on an academic freedom program, and they should involve the AHA, the Historical Association, and they should involve the American Political Science Association, sociology, and so on. That's how AAUP founded. But AAUP, unfortunately, when it was founded on the basis of college faculty, and they never did account for K-12 teachers nor students. And I was on the national council for the AUP for a while, and I argued there that they should expand to include them. And I served a couple of terms on AUP's National Committee A, which is Academic Freedom and Tenure. And the first chair I had some trouble with, but the second chair was a guy I really have a lot of respect for. I knew him previously, Bob O'Neill. O'Neill had been the youngest constitutional law professor at Berkeley at one time, and he came to Buffalo as a academic vice president under a president when they brought Myerson in, and turning the university in a really good place. Bob O'Neill and I did a couple of projects together and had a lot of respect for him. Bob then came in as the chair of the AUP Academic Freedom and Tenure Committee, and I proposed to him there ought to be they ought to think about rewriting that document to incorporate students and teachers, K-12 teachers. They were all the products of the same institutions, and so he agreed, and they got money from the Levi Foundation to do it, because apparently Levi Foundation found some teachers that were having problems, and they set up this committee. But unfortunately, they can't set up the committee in such a way that they had the membership was from colleges and a few teacher associations. But instead of sending the teachers, they sent association people, like the guy who was the second in command of the national science teachers. Well, they don't have the same academic freedom interest. And so they produced a document which never went anywhere. They produced a document that was very fluid, saying, we like teachers, we think they're wonderful people, and we think they deserve academic freedom, but they never got it into their own document. So that all sort of fell apart. I wish they'd continued it. So
Well, now let me.
Neil, by the way, wrote. I edited a couple of issues of social education on academic freedom, and I got Bob O'Neill to write. He wrote some very good articles for each of those, and he then went on to become the president of the University of Virginia, and he established there the Thomas Jefferson Center for Free Expression. And here now, Virginia is the place that the president has just resigned out of threat. Okay, so sorry, I just see the circle and all those things.
No, I think you're absolutely right. There's an unfortunate, I would call it an insidious relationship between the people who want to have their vision of the United States imposed and the institutions that should be challenging it, but too often don't.
Yeah.
Well, let me turn to our last few questions here, and these are common for every interview we do for the podcast. So I'm going to start with the first one.
Are you going to rate me on how well I do?
No, not at all. Not at
Okay.
all. There's no
Will
rating
do.
scale. This is an open academic freedom issue.
So I can say whatever I want to. Okay.
That's exactly right.
Well, I want to tell people what a nice person you are.
Who would be the most influential role model for your work in defending academic freedom?
Well, academic freedom. I'd have to say John Dewey. He is the key figure in that whole early development that said academic freedom should be a right for all people who work in education, teachers, students, etc. And he never veered from that. And he did some. I thought his How We Think book was an excellent treatise on how we come to decide things, but he allows all kinds of critical judgment, and you end up with the idea that criticizing is important and challenging the society is important. So I would stick John Dewey in there, but I would also put Bob O'Neill in. Now that I think about him again, unfortunately he died a couple of years ago now. But he was a very, very thoughtful guy, and he drew out of this large body of information on constitutional law. I think he may have served with Brennan at one point as one of the clerks for Brennan at one time. I gotta look into that and see. I can't remember.
Second question, what quote most effectively sums up your view of the importance of academic freedom and the right to education?
This may reflect my jaundiced view of history, but I don't think in quote terms. So I wish I had a nice quote to give to you. I don't, I can't think of, John Dewey must have said some really wonderful things. I just can't tell you what the quotes are. He did try to distinguish between citizenship and the name escapes me now, but he tried to distinguish between citizenship, like citizenship education, loyalty, and patriotism, and civic duty, which may have to do with challenging the society. That I thought is it's not really a quote, but it's the theme. It's the idea that's more important to me than what the quote says.
Okay, and the last question is, if you had the power to make one critical change to advance academic freedom in the U.S., what would you recommend?
Oh, well, that goes back. I would say standardize the tenure requirements for all educators and make them a national requirement. But I think, I've been led to believe over time, and it seems to be, that at least with the protection of tenure, you have some legal grounds to challenge the people out to get you.
Before we close here, I just wanted to say that one of the things that's always impressed me about you, Jack, is that you continue to learn. And I think that is a very important issue in terms of how we view academic freedom, because if we don't continue to inquire and be critical, then I think, unfortunately, the whole idea of a vibrant intellectual culture is passe.
I agree. I agree. It's why we can't just standardize teaching to require memorization and recitation. That seems to be inadequate. And I'm 92, and I'm glad you accused me of being a learner, because that's probably the nicest compliment. Better than being a professor. Okay.
Well, one other thing that's going on right now, which I think is a very positive development, is that I think the whole field of scholarship that has challenged traditional conceptions of the past, whether it's from African American history, Latino history, indigenous history, and so forth, remains pretty vital. And I think if we continue to have that sort of development, and it's not only in history, it's in all the fields, then I think the efforts by the federal government to quash it all won't work.
Well, I'd like to believe that there are a lot of very thoughtful people out there that don't express it through the vote all the time. They just go along with things, but they're still very thoughtful, and that MAGA is not anywhere near as extensive and cultish as might otherwise be believed. The anti-communist groups thought that too, and they sort of died away. They can arise again at any time, but that's died away. I just have a feeling that the next two elections are going to be extremely important. The ones for Congress in particular, as a bellwether, and then the next presidential the build up to the election will be very, very important. And that, I think, will tell us a lot about what happened during the remaining of most of this century.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, Jack, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you today, and
thank you, Bill. It's always a pleasure talking with you.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HREUSA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Pocket Casts, Player FM, and Deezer. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy@hreusa.org. That's KRISTI@hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius-Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Tina Hinz, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Goda. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.